Good morning. How we doing? Fired up, ready to go? First session? It's feeling good? I do like the, we call it the church effect. If anybody does want to come up, that's okay. We don't bite. But if you're comfortable back there, that's cool. I'm Frank DiGiamarino. I run our U.S. state and local government business for Amazon Web Services. Very excited to be here. Been at Amazon for a little over 4 years. And this is a little bit of a different panel than, I don't know, has anybody been to this session before? We've done it a couple of times. Yeah, there's a few folks. What we've done is pulled together some of folks who have gone all in on AWS. And what we like to do is have a little bit from them, where they'll tell you a little bit about their story. And then I'll ask them some questions, and then you guys get to ask them questions. So we'll try to make this interactive, and so be thinking of things that you want to talk about along the way. So I'm going to start with I was going to start with Eric, but Mike's right here. You ready to go?
I'm ready to go.
So you're just going to give a little overview on who you are and your story, and maybe any lessons learned or advice to folks who are going in, and we'll do that for
Keep it
each.
to 20 minutes or so.
Yeah, approximately half an hour each.
Great. Good morning, everybody. My name is Mike Chappell. I'm from the University of Notre Dame, which, for those of you who don't know, is about 90 miles east of here in northern Indiana. And we are a top 25 research university, and we do a wide variety of things from an IT perspective. I know I see some people around the room who are also in higher ed IT, so forgive me for telling you what your jobs are. But for those who are in other industries, one of the most interesting things about IT and higher education is we're all responsible for running the infrastructure of essentially a small city. So we not only have the systems that you would imagine we have that support our core mission of research and teaching, but we also have power plants, hotels. We even have a cemetery. I was joking to Eric before we started that unless any of you want to dispute this claim, I'm going to right now make the assertion that we have the only cemetery in the world powered by AWS.
We've been dying to have that.
That's it, folks. So we have a pretty diverse set of services that we offer. We have, depending upon how you count, and there's all different ways, somewhere between 500 and 1,000 different services that we need to support. And there are a wide variety of applications. So when I go to these conferences, it's interesting because I think there really are two different groups of people usually in these rooms. Some of them are like us, where you have a lot of services that don't necessarily scale very much. A few of them do, but relative to the services that some of you are running, ours don't scale a lot, but they're very diverse. And then there's another group of people who, the Netflixes and photo sharing services of the world that have one or two services that scale almost infinitely. So we began our journey to the cloud in 2012 when we were just dabbling a little bit. We were looking for a way to make our website resilient in the face of disasters and emergencies, whether it's a natural disaster or some sort of tragedy or other type of attention. And we can get into it a little more later, but long story short, we wound up choosing AWS to move our website and provide that scalability and resiliency. And during that journey of moving that one service, we realized there was an opportunity to potentially move more. And over the next couple of years, we collaborated with colleagues from other schools. Oren here in the front row is one of them from the University of Chicago, and developed a strategy for moving almost all of our services to the cloud. And we've now set the goal of being 80% in the cloud by the end of next year. We're about a year and a half into the time that we have, so about halfway through. And today we're at 53%. So where's Michelle? I saw her walking in. She always yells at me because I say the number wrong. Are we actually 53%? All right.
She was,
she was fact checker.
Yeah.
So that's us. And, you wanted a lesson learned?
Yeah, just share a lesson learned along the way.
So one, The first thing that comes to mind is the culture, but I know you want to talk a little bit more about that later. So let me put a pin in that one and talk about maybe for people who are thinking about making this journey who haven't started yet. I think the most important thing you can do in the early stages of a migration to the cloud is choose your initial migrations carefully. So we picked, after we moved the website, we were toying with the idea of a cloud-first strategy, we chose 4 services that had a couple of things in common. First, we were highly confident that the move would be successful. We wanted to have easy wins. We certainly didn't want to have a failed pilot project. But they also had a demonstrable value to the business, where there was a real reason for moving it to the cloud, and the customers of that service would see improvements, either in performance or scalability, sometimes in cost. And that really, choosing those carefully, I think, is one of the most important things that you can do early on.
Excellent. Eric.
Good morning. My name is Eric Geiger. I'm the Managing Director for the Federal Home Loan Bank of Chicago. We're a $70 billion wholesale bank, and what that means is that we essentially lend money to smaller banks. If you're Bank of America or you're Chase or one of these immense world-reaching banks, you can borrow money from anyone, cities, countries, states, doesn't matter. But if you're a mid-sized bank, if you're First Bank of small town USA, it's much harder to reach out to London to borrow money from them. So you can come to us, and we'll loan you money. We function as a co-op. In the Chicago bank specifically, we serve 900 member banks throughout Wisconsin and Illinois. And there are federal home loan banks spread across the United States. There are currently, I think, 11 other home loan banks, maybe 10, because there was a merger recently. So for us, when we were going to the cloud, our journey started about 4 years ago, almost 5 years ago. And we took the advice of my Notre Dame friend. We started out with one very small application, and we put it in the cloud mostly because we wanted to test to see how that would work, and it worked extremely well. And it took us a very short amount of time before we realized that this was the direction we wanted to take all of our infrastructure. And I was recently talking to some of the folks that work with me and some of our Amazon peers, and it occurred to me yesterday that a year ago, almost to the day, we actually were 100% in the cloud. So for the last year, we've been operating at 100% in the cloud extremely effectively, continuing to provide a high level of service to not only our internal bank workers, but as well as our 900 member bank customers. And it's been a really good, successful project for us, and we've seen a lot of returns on that. As far as the idea of some advice, for the early adopters, I know in the past I've talked about making sure you've got your network diagrams, set up, because there's some things that are harder to change once you're a year in, even once you're 4 or 5 months in. But I think from the early adoption piece, as we've now done it for a year, one of the things that I would say you want to have a good idea about, you don't have to have it maybe finalized, but you want to have a good idea about how you're going to continue to control cost. Because one of the interesting things inside Amazon, if you're in a traditional data center and somebody wants a new server, it's a lot of work. You have to buy a server. You have limited amounts of memory on your VM infrastructure, and you have to take something out of a box and put it in a rack, and that takes time and that's hard. In Amazon, though, you want a server, you can have one right now. And so if you've got a really aggressive development team or infrastructure team coming up with new ideas constantly and constantly and constantly, testing things out because it's simple and it's cheap, and then they forget to terminate those instances, well, it suddenly stops being so cheap. So having a good idea of what your control mechanism will be to help avoid that sprawl, to help avoid that cost, or that additional unnecessary cost, I would really recommend thinking about that as you are doing your rollout, unlike us, who thought about it once we had fully gotten invested, and then came back and said, "Oh, yeah, that is important. We really want to tackle that."
Right.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Sergey. I'm the CTO of MPAC, Municipal Property Assessment Corporation. We're from Canada, so hey to our neighbors. Bieber lives a few blocks away from me, so if you have any questions afterwards.
Ooh.
Yeah, so what we do is basically we basically value properties in Ontario. We have about 5 million properties. We generate about a few $1 trillion in assessment revenue for our municipalities and our stakeholders. We're probably, I'm looking at my boss, we're probably the largest assessment corporation in the world, right? We probably have the most number of property base in the world, right? So what's interesting for us is that, so Amazon, so I'll jump right into it. Amazon is an interesting fit for us because our workloads are highly, are dynamic, right? So we have our peaks and then we have our troughs, right? So because obviously we don't value the entire province, all 5 million properties all at once. We actually span it out in a couple of months from September to November, and that's when we need a lot of horsepower, a lot of memory, a lot of VM infrastructure to actually produce these values. Our journey is it's pretty simple. We also wanted to, like Mike, we also wanted to stand up an external-facing application for taxpayers who can log on and figure out what the value is and how we actually got that value. So we basically use a credit card and logged on and created an AWS account. We provisioned, like Eric, provisioned a couple of VMs, used MySQL, RDS instances. We ETL'd all of our data into AWS. We didn't even have a VPC at that point, so we're pretty embryonic. And it cost us, I think, like $40 a month, right? Which is huge. Right? And also because I didn't have to go through a hellish procurement cycle, which would take 5 years. So that was great, right? And that was our story. My advice is that if you don't keep an eye on your costs, it's basically like you're walking in the world with one eye closed, right? In the public sector, my assumption is all people in public sector, they get an extra level of scrutiny when it comes to budget and how we're spending them. And especially in Canada, right? Like we didn't have anybody. If I was to look to my left or look to my right, there wasn't anybody within our ecosystem or our peers or our colleagues or other companies or other corporations, government corporations, or even private for that matter, within my own network that were in AWS, right? So it was it was a pretty bold maneuver for public. For a small public, I call it a backwater corporation, for a small public backwater corporation to actually go in all in into AWS, but it's paying huge dividends, huge.
Great. So let's go to the culture question that you alluded to first. So, and you guys set out this 4-year, 3 or 4 year, 3-year program, and now you're working the whole system to get into your 53% of the way. So talk about culture in that context and getting people on board.
Yeah, I can't understate the importance of the cultural transformation that particularly for like an old school enterprise IT shop you need to make. It's really a significant mindset shift. And for us, we had some early successes and then we had some stumbles, and now I think we're on a pretty good groove. So I'd say in the very early days when we were just doing pilot projects and when we did our website move, it was more of a novelty than anything else. And I think people looked at it, the phrase I used with Eric when we were chatting before the session started is those of us who were early adopters we're just getting to the point where people are shifting from thinking we're crazy to thinking that we might have had a good idea, and that's nice. But I'd say that same thing happened internally for us. And the first migrations we did were people just, I would say most of the organization looked at them a little bit skeptically, thinking, oh, well, okay, well, they'll try that, and then we'll wind up moving things back. And then when we got some momentum and really started moving, that's when the FUD, the fear, uncertainty, and doubt kicked in quite a bit, because people started seeing the potential of going to a cloud-first strategy, and the organization started really shifting. The momentum shifted in that direction. And that's when probably in different areas, people started getting concerned about what does this mean for my future in the organization. And that's a really powerful emotion to have when people start getting concerned about their jobs. So we really put a lot of time and energy into making sure that people understood our strategy, and also that they understood that we weren't approaching the cloud in an effort to reduce headcount or lay people off. We actually weren't even, cutting costs wasn't even one of our stated goals. We wound up saving quite a bit of money along the way, but we were approaching it to get the flexibility and the agility and the scalability that you wind up having in the cloud. And we just had to repeat that message over and over again and help people understand that we didn't have a vision of a shrinking workforce. We had a vision of a changing workforce. And as long as people were willing to invest the time and mental energy in gaining new skills, that there would be a role for them in the new organization. And we did that, and some people wound up changing jobs a little bit. I think that probably the most striking example of that is one of the folks on our team who's responsible for literally running physical data centers that we weren't going to have anymore. We wound up repurposing him completely, and actually along the lines of what Sujit and Eric were talking about in cost. He became our financial ninja, our cloud cost ninja. And his job, we use Cloudability for that sort of thing, and he's our Cloudability guru and helps us track our reserved instances and optimize things. So I think it's actions like that, though, that speak a lot louder than anything you can say, and just showing people visible examples of our commitment to helping people find new opportunities worked well. And now I think we're at a point where we've really hit a groove, and things are going pretty well, and the culture has changed almost completely. There's still pockets here and there, but the pendulum has certainly shifted for us.
Do you still have the infographic?
We do. We don't have it on the slide, I don't think, do we?
But you used it. Talk about how that played a role.
So this was in the very early stages of our strategy. So after we decided to go all in, and before we actually really started moving things, we put together an infographic to just tell our story a little bit. And it goes through, what's our goal? We're going to move 80% of our services to the cloud over the next 3 years. It talks about why. It talks about why we chose AWS, because I think one of the early questions we started getting from people was around vendor lock-in. Some of you have probably heard the same thing. I see a lot of heads starting to nod. And we told the story of why we thought it was important to pick one vendor as our infrastructure as a service partner, and also why we chose AWS as that partner. And then gave people some resources to go to for more information. So I plastered that thing all over the place.
Yeah, it's a cool little piece. So I'm just going to skip to the next question, but if you guys want to weigh in on any of that, you're more than welcome. And we might get to more of that in the Q&A. But Eric, I wanted you to talk about security and what your frame was on security in the cloud, especially with money and banking.
Is that a problem?
If you forget about my mortgage, I want to.
It's not really what we do. And so, security, actually this ties well into the buy-in piece, because of course, as a financial institution, and when you look back 5 years, there weren't a lot of us that were beginning to do things in the cloud, especially when it came to the vast majority of our data. There were small things here and there. But security was one of the first things. After we got through this small app, everybody had to really hit the brakes and say, well, wait a minute. We need to consider the security around all of this. We need to consider all the compliance aspects of this. I mean, as far as our organization goes, we're a federally regulated financial institution. And so we began a big campaign of buy-in from our internal auditors, from our regulators, and that amounted to immense amounts of paperwork on our part. So for any of you who are familiar with COBIT and with NIST, we essentially took both of those frameworks and then took all of Amazon's attestations as well as all of our controls, our internal controls, and we ran them up against those two frameworks. So that at the end of the day, we created a document that said, A, we covered 95% of these things internally already, that Amazon didn't break any of those controls. And in the few places where we felt that maybe there was a gap, we then created controls to fill those gaps. We then had to take, from the security perspective, a new mindset around the infrastructure and the architecture, because of course we were using more traditional data centers. The security architecture around the network and around some of the controls on the systems, in Amazon those have to change. And everyone has to really adopt what, I think internally we're calling affectionately a cloud mentality. I think externally that's what everyone calls it as well. We had to really adopt this cloud mentality so that we were architecting things to work in the cloud. And we weren't getting stuck thinking about data centers the way that everyone had been thinking about data centers for the last 30 years prior. And that was a big, big push. We had to really get our entire internal security department and our audit department, we had to get them to change the way they think. And that's no small task. Ironically, it was our regulator that really got on board the fastest, which was a huge advantage for us. Then it was our internal audit department, which, again, a huge advantage to us. And finally, it was a lot of work with our internal security department to get them to a level where they felt that what we were doing at the time could be done equivalently inside Amazon. And we got there. Now, I think it's important to note, we weren't asking to create something better than what we were doing, because again, we were running it up against our existing controls. We were looking for equivalency. And we got to equivalency pretty fast. Pretty fast in terms of the Homeland Banking system. It only took us about a year to get everyone to agree. And then from there, that's when we started our big push toward going all in.
So did you want to weigh in on any of the culture or security or?
Oh yeah, it's pretty similar to what Mike was saying, right? So being the size we are, some of our hardware, I wouldn't say aging, was aged like a fine wine. It was like some of our servers were like 15 years old, right? Like wow. When Sun Microsystems was still on, I still miss that logo, right? So for us to actually make that move would be a huge amount of financial investment, right? And we had a lot of server huggers, or I call them server huggers, and they still remember the first time they rack and stack that server with their own two hands, and they treated them like pets. there was genuine affection for hardware and some parts of the team, right? So how do you move away from that tactile mindset to something that's you can provision at a moment's notice in the cloud, and you can't touch or feel or even see the little green lights blink anymore. So what we took, apart from governance, which is very important, also DevOps. How do you use DevOps and actually bring both the R&D teams and the infrastructure teams together and actually push out an application which is worthy of business needs, and then become a true IT department? I would argue we're actually doing more IT work than previously, running around, buying servers, rack and stack, and now we get all that time back, as you were saying, Eric, all that time back to actually test, run privacy, and as well as security tests, because in Canada we have once again, I hope I'm right, but being in the public sector, you get scrutinized extra, you get extra layer of scrutiny. Like we have people's income data. We have, malls, we have all their revenue information, which obviously is not as critical as a bank, but it's still private information, right? So we need to protect that. And if we're going to put it into a Redshift instance in Amazon, how does one protect that? How does one tokenize that? So all of these things were always mulling around in our heads, and sometimes we had to leave our shores and go to the Privacy Commissioner of Ontario and say, we'd like to move to Amazon for obvious reasons, speed, agility, everything, all that stuff, which she didn't really care about. All she cared about was how are you going to protect the data once it crosses the U.S. The border, right? Once it leaves Canadian soil, how do you ensure that you're protecting people's income data, their private data, their gender, their religion, their first names, last name, their address, mailing, you name it, in the U.S. So there was a huge shift, both on the infra side, but also on the business culture side, to actually make sure that our data was indeed secure and it was protected as we crossed the border.
Mm-hmm. I think you hit on a really important point there, Sujit, that servers as pets concept is something that really is a significant barrier to the cultural change, and it doesn't end just because you move to the cloud. You just go from having physical pets to having virtual pets. And if you really want to get to a world where you're leveraging automation and doing things well, people have to be comfortable with their pets being killed all the time. and I think you wind up with this concept of like a servers as like these handcrafted artisan products, and they really are just functional tools, and that's probably a more difficult cultural shift than physical to virtual or virtual on-prem to the cloud.
Yeah. So I want to turn this out to the audience and see, does anybody have a question? Anybody want to?
Great presentation.
Good.
Don't call on him.
And then, actually, Krista, can you do the mic? He's going to go. So he'll go first, and then we'll run a mic around if we. Oh, that's tethered. But please go ahead.
Question for Mike. Your current goal is 80%. Once you get to that 80%, do you see yourself getting to 100%, or are there reasons that you won't be able to do that?
No, I don't see us getting to 100%. And to be honest, we chose that 80% goal fairly arbitrarily at first, and then we did the math later and found out that it actually worked. So that was good. My intuition right now is that we're probably going to wind up going past that 80% goal. Not necessarily by the end of next year, but as we move, and we'll probably get closer to 90%. But there are a set of services that we run that we do want to keep on premise. And for a couple of different reasons. Sometimes it's around latency. We have we have a lot of research equipment that generates lots and lots of data or pulls a lot of data back and forth. And separating the storage from that physical equipment tends to cause issues. The other thing we have is equipment that actually controls some of our physical infrastructure. So our telephone system, our building control system, our power plant systems, those sorts of things, where in the event there's a network disruption between campus and the internet, we want the systems to remain online and connected to the equipment that they're controlling rather than the internet.
All right, well, you answered most of my question already, but for the ones that are at 100%, how do you handle some of the things that he's keeping on premise? And all the other things like video surveillance, desktop imaging, those kind of things.
For us, we actually run all of our desktops in the cloud as well. So that removes a big piece of that latency. And we don't have to deal with things like power plant equipment. So for some of our applications, we've had to make some changes to accommodate the fact that they're in the cloud. But for the most part, because of our desktops, and because we moved all of the rest of our infrastructure, we never really ran into big latency problems. Now, we are currently wrestling with video, since you mentioned it specifically. And at the end of the day, we're in the middle of trying to solve that problem. We're actually cracking that nut through some of our partner relationships between either Citrix, changing our thin clients, and doing some other things to help speed up that particular piece of traffic. And I think we're going to get there by the end of this year.
Thanks.
Did you want to, and I can relay your question if you wanted to.
Yeah, so I was going to say, so as Mike said, I'm also in higher ed, and one of the things I think has been an advantage in the higher education space is, we're not competitive with each other really at this level. So there's been a lot of cooperation across institutions, and we've gotten together and had meetings and written papers and published some stuff. And I'm just wondering if it's the same in other public sector niches.
It's certainly the same for the home loan banking system. Like I said, we have a defined territory. None of the other home loan banks can compete in our territory. Even though all of the home loan banks do operate as independent companies, the amount of technology and information that we share, particularly when it comes to how we went into the cloud. I mean, Chicago is leading that space for the other home loan banks. It's very open and we're working a lot with the other home loan banks on helping them with some of their early challenges, showing them sort of our roadmap for how we got there.
Did you want to?
Yeah, in Canada, I don't know about the public organizations here, but they're very large, lumbering beasts, full of red tape.
Yeah, that's not the way it is in the United States.
Okay, good. That's good to know, actually. But recently, after successes in AWS of the stuff that we've been running, we've actually gained some fame across some of our stakeholders. I wouldn't say some of our peers, some of the ministries definitely, maybe in the near future, but definitely our stakeholders like municipalities. For example, the city of Toronto, which is I think probably the same size of Chicago, maybe slightly smaller. We're actually actively discussing with them on our journey on a very intimate level and how we made things and how we broke down the privacy barriers and how we satiated the Privacy Commissioner of Ontario, which is no easy feat. And speaking to them about moving some of their data. Not all of it, because but what's interesting about the city of Toronto is that they have very diverse data sets, right? So they have garbage bag RFIDs, and then they have a young child's daycare health records. So they could start by moving the garbage bag RFIDs into AWS, right? So we're having some initial discussions with them, and I know if we can crack that nut, then the other municipalities who do cooperate with the City of Toronto, because it's the largest player, will actually follow. So stay tuned.
Yeah, but I would just add, I think it's interesting, sort of culturally, that when it comes to this thing, when it comes to the cloud and Amazon in particular, the community is extremely agreeable. Like, there's not a lot of sort of keeping a secret about how we did this particular part of a migration. There are a lot of people online, in person, extremely willing to talk to you about how you can do different types of things. And it's actually been one of the nicer things about working with Amazon. They also have been very open about talking about the best practices, some of the missteps you can take. It's been very beneficial.
You, Anu.
Mike, could you talk about the first applications that you moved to the cloud?
Sure.
So first applications to move to the cloud.
Yeah, so there are 5. I'll probably miss one by the time I work my way through the list here. But the first thing was our website. That's kind of the easy, no-brainer win for this sort of thing. And a related one that we also moved, so the website was like our main university website, and then we have a content management system that's sort of this homebrew bundle of fun that hosts about 500 departmental sites, and that was the next thing that we moved. We extended our identity and access management infrastructure into the cloud, so that was an interesting one, and it raised a few eyebrows at first because people thought, oh, you're moving a core security service. We weren't actually moving it at the time. We were extending it, and the main reason we did that was to be able to be resilient in the event of a failure on campus. So we have so many, about a quarter of our services are software as a service out in other clouds, or actually many of them run in Amazon's cloud also. But we wound up where we had if we have a network outage on campus, the fact that those SaaS vendors are tied to our on-campus identity and access management infrastructure made those services unavailable for no good reason. So by extending out into the cloud, we were able to do that. We also moved backups of our on-premise systems. That was a big one for us because it was a huge cost savings. Being able to, we were coming up on a huge purchase of infrastructure to be able to maintain backups on-premise. And by moving those out to S3, we were able to avoid that investment that we had budgeted for, and that actually funded, it's actually still funded almost all of what we're doing today. We're just at the point where we're starting to have to dip into other money, but that was a big one. And then, what am I missing, Michelle? Oh, our mobile site, which she's showing to me on her tablet back there. Our mobile infrastructure and applications moved out there. A fine city. Yeah.
Yes.
The question maybe for Frank. My history, I managed IT and
Can we get that mic on, by the way, back there, Alex?
I managed IT in financial industries for over 20 years, so I'm familiar with the things Eric and everyone's doing. But in the public sector of a city, how do you address some of the concerns, specifically in the public safety environment. Like our police department is very concerned, and they think that to secure it and to manage it, that they have to be totally isolated in their own environment, on their own servers, in their own domains. And we want to work with them and teach them that we will look at data and applications individually and move the ones that make sense to AWS. Their biggest concern is with CGIS and IDAX. And they kind of not hide, they protect themselves with that because they don't want to jeopardize anything. So any words of wisdom on how to get that? It's a cultural thing, it's what resources are available.
All of it, and we should probably spend some time after. We'd love to talk to you more about all of that. First of all, there's nothing inherently different about how you do security in the cloud than how you do security on-prem. And that's part of that is that education and helping understand. So engaging around that early and often is really important. I'd also say there's, I've been doing this for 4.5 years, and we talk about a maturity model of sorts around going to the cloud. The first is having a definition and really understanding what it is. The second is a policy of some kind that pushes you towards cloud. The third is security and accreditation and having, feeling safe about the models and the controls that you have. The fourth is procurement and having a way to buy it. And then the fifth is the governance and the culture and the training that are going to be built into a new model of how you get this done. These guys would probably say they've done some or all of that in some capacity, and especially if like Eric's 100% in, he's worked through all of those things. The one thing I would touch on for you is we do CGIS. We understand the whole process and how it works and what you need to work through. That is one of those things to just sit down and go through it and understand what the compliance models are and how it works, what applications you have, what other vendors that we have. We have lots of vendors that are doing things on us, whether it's body cameras or RMS or analytics or open data around policing. That's becoming a new interesting trend. So we'd be happy to engage and talk more.
Perfect, thank you.
The other thing I'd offer to you is, in addition to a hotel, cemetery, and power plant, we also run a police department in the city of South Bend, and we'd be happy to connect and talk about that.
I love that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is for any or all of you guys. So your stories are similar because you choose a highly optimized first choice. You make a great first choice. You say, let's do this first. Let's show the value. The value proposition. You want to continue down the path. But as you go down that path, you had 5 things you listed. As you go down the path, is there less and less value? Like, there's a cost associated with each step that you make, and you do the high value things first, and then there's less and less value as you go. So, is there a crossover point where you just decide, I'm not going to move this because it would be easier for us to just keep it in-house, or it'd be lower cost, right? There's always going to come down to a cost.
I think there is, but the way I characterize it is the early moves you make when you start picking those high-value targets, the low-hanging fruit, you're getting immediate return off of a single migration. And I think as you move and as you have more and more in the cloud, you don't get that anymore, except in a few the outlier cases. But you're working towards a huge gain that comes from the economy of scale of moving large things and being able to shut down large pieces of infrastructure. So I think the value is still there, but it shifts in its nature a little bit.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. Especially the first part. In our case, we started with a high-performance computing system. So, we were able to spin down an enormous amount of infrastructure that was very expensive and go to very, much cheaper infrastructure. The ratio of the savings was large. That ratio gets a lot smaller. There's still savings. It just gets a little smaller. And I certainly agree, the economy of scale, you benefit from that greatly, but not only that, there's a point, we certainly felt it, where running a lot of infrastructure in the cloud and still having a lot of infrastructure on-prem, that really begins to put a strain on your procedures and your policies, and that itself has this sort of unstated cost that help push more and more into the cloud, help buffer the diminishing savings percentage with just a time benefit to our staff.
That's a good point. Thanks.
While we're getting the next question, you also, though, said, Mike, it was about agility and speed in some cases, too, right? So it's not always about cost.
Yeah.
Do you want to?
I think that's absolutely right. So engineers, when they get their hands on this stuff, they just love it because they can do things quickly. You can, Eric was saying earlier, it becomes very, very easy to just spin things up, try things, test them, destroy it, start over again, and move with an agility and a nimbleness that you just don't have as easily, at least on premise.
Yeah, no, we ran into this sort of fascinating scenario where some of our apps were performing poorly. And back in the day, even today, it takes us weeks to figure out where that bottleneck is using all the different tools we have available. Having Amazon allows us to, for a very short period of time, just add a lot of power to that server to compensate for that performance problem. Now, the irresponsible thing would be to leave it that way. So we then take those few weeks, figure out where that bottleneck is, fix that problem, and then we can spin that server back down to one of our standard, mid-range instances. And it's a huge shift for our infrastructure and support staff in terms of how they work. They don't have to, back in the day, you wouldn't have bought a server to then do a test, to then have a server that you didn't need. So it's really been helpful.
Do you want?
Yeah, it's pretty much similar to Mike and Eric. I'm coming in last with these things, but
First next time.
yeah, first. But yeah, it's because the workloads are so cyclical. So what we do is, once again, just like Mike and Eric, we basically spin up 100 spot instances, right? And then we basically trudge through all our models, our statistical models, right? And then we actually generate the values and then pour them back into a Redshift instance, right? So for us, we basically taken what normally would have taken 3 months, and we crunch it back into 15 to 20 minutes, right? Which is huge because not only are you kind of saving costs on the infrastructure side, obviously, because I've got a ton of aged infrastructure, but now business get back that time. So instead of waiting weeks or months for the property value to show up in Ottawa or Toronto, they basically wait minutes. And now business can have more scrutiny on those values and actually come up with better adjusted values. So we found with AWS, we've had a huge business productivity uptake, right? Where literally people used to come in on Friday, run a model, pray, go home and pray, and hopefully it'll finish by Monday morning, right? The people used to tell me that they should take the kids to the hockey match, right? While the model is running. Hopefully by the time they get from the hockey match, the model is finished running so they can look at the values, right? Now all they have to do is make a cup of coffee, Tim's, not Starbucks, all right? Go Tim's. And then come back and the model's finished, right? So there's gain on the business side as well that is extremely profound. Huge.
Got it.
You got it?
I got the date. The Canadian. Who invited the Canadian? Please.
Okay, so I have we've talked a lot about moving workloads to the cloud. I'm kind of curious as to how you move the meatware to the cloud. So you had these existing support organizations that are built around physical on-prem infrastructure, and you need to develop the skill sets and create new teams to deal with infrastructure as code and a lot of these other concepts which may be foreign to existing, say, systems administrators. So I'm interested in your stories on how you evolved your IT organizations into the cloud as well.
Oh, I go first this time? I didn't hear the question. No, so basically, so I'm a bit, I hope I answered this properly, but I'm a bit of in a weird animal, right? So not only do I have aged infrastructure, I have aged software, right? We're still running traditional ASP pages. They're so old I can't even download Visual Studio to edit them, right? So on the R&D side, so I'll hit the R&D side. So the way we're migrating into the cloud there is like we're rewriting using open source stacks, right? Which is one of the reasons we chose AWS, right? So we don't have that huge vendor lock-in, the huge stacks, and so on and so forth. But on the infrastructure side, as I said before, we're really trying to look at them, become fast followers, right? We're not trying to reinvent the wheel or boil the ocean. We're really saying, hey, how do other people do it, right? And we're looking at models very much like Netflix, right? Netflix of the world, the Yahoos of the world, the Hulus of the world, to say, how do they manage data, right? Because obviously, they have a ton of data. And I should look out there, because as I've said, it's a very lonely field right now up there, right, in Canada. So with that, we're also adhering to some of the governance structures when it comes to infrastructure. And you mentioned infrastructure as a code, and rely heavily onto DevOps, and use stuff like Chef, and Puppet, and move people away from the physical, tactile, into the virtual world, where now they're creating recipes that can be used over and over again, and these recipes can become much more sophisticated with the press of a button, right? I keep telling people there, it's all about outcomes. It's not about activities anymore, right? So Sergey, I backed it up. I backed up the server, but you backed it up to the wrong place. You overwrote some things, but the activity was done, so I can go home and get a pat on my back. It's all about outcomes now, right? So move the teams into a more virtual world, and at the same time provide much more business productivity. I hope I answered that question.
Where did he go?
Is it in the back?
In the back.
Oh, you're there. Is that what you want? You want?
Yeah, sorry about that.
I was more interested in the people stories.
Yeah.
With the actual employees that do the work, that may not have the skill sets that translate into public cloud.
Yeah, but they do.
But they do.
The thing about moving to the cloud is, like, we talk about DevOps, Chef and all the different recipes. There are all these incredible things you can do to really capitalize on that economy of scale and really drive, costs down. You don't have to do them, though. The skill sets of traditional technologists, with the exception of being able to pick up, a large server and rack it, right? With the exception of that physical requirement, they're more or less the same. Systems are still getting administered in the same way. You're still monitoring things in the same way. Most of your controls and most of your day-to-day feels very much the same. And one of the jokes we had made when we started moving was, if you really feel like you need to see that blinking light, we will get you a little box with a blinking light, and we'll just put it on your desk. But the skill sets are the same. Now, that isn't to say that you don't want to then begin doing aggressive training on things like Chef, that you don't want to do aggressive training on new DevOps styles of managing your things. Infrastructure as code is incredible. I mean, nobody, I think, could argue that it isn't. It gives you this immense amount of power all inside your scripts that you never had before. We actually were just talking about a scenario. Want 400 servers? You can have 400 servers in 5 minutes if you want. And you could never have done that the traditional way. So getting those things is extremely beneficial, but you don't have to have them on day one. And so you can slowly work with your team to migrate into that DevOps model, migrate into those more efficient models, and train them on a pace that makes sense for them.
Did you have somebody responsible for training, or how did you manage the training program, if there was such a thing?
Well, so I have a couple of extremely dedicated employees who are very interested in Amazon. They're both actually here. And they took the reins and really worked initially with our infrastructure and support teams. And then, to be honest, we actually sort of forgot about the development folks for a while. Our head of development is here as well. We actually forgot about them for a while. We got a lot of buy-in for that traditional ops group. And now, they're taking them down more of this DevOps path. Once we got all that infrastructure really running, it then occurred to us, man, we've missed a huge stakeholder with our development team. And so now, over the last, 6 months, 5 months, we've been aggressively working with them to get them up to speed on some of the new tools that are available, some of the new processes that are available. A lot of that happened after our infrastructure moved. And that's what I mean by you don't need to have those things enabled to actually move your infrastructure. If you've done any data center move, it feels the exact same moving into Amazon. But you begin to really start to see some of that economy, some of that savings, some of that efficiency, really starts to kick in the more the training you have.
Sorry, I'd just like to add something to what Mike was saying. Eric was saying, is that one of the things that I've personally seen out of this move is that AWS is actually bringing us closer together. I know it's a bit cliche, but so you know the old times I should be a developer, right? You throw stuff over the wall, it's okay for a guy install it, and they're stuffing it down the server, and there's no health check. The health check is like on HTTP port 8080 where the standard is 8. Like it's all a nightmare. So now we're trying to infuse the infrastructure in R&D teams where there's very little differentiation. I mean, there's still different, but you know what I mean? Like everybody works together. And what's really got my attention is that the infrastructure folks actually understand the context on what the application is doing, right? Like if this web server goes down, if this web service goes down, what does it affect? Because it's all baked into it. And because they were there, so instead of handing it over at point X, they're there right from the point of Genesis, right? So now they have, the infrastructure folks in particular are actually learning the business logic and beginning to talk to business people at their at their level, not at their level, but beginning to understand what it actually does. So I'm finding it really interesting as it's actually breaking down the wall between these two groups within the context of MPAC at least.
Yeah, I think that's important. And one of the things that we also did is we literally broke down some of the walls.
Really?
We've co-located our cloud team.
Yeah.
We actually reclaimed, it's kind of fun, the operations floor from our data center. We tore out all the old console racks and all of that, put in some nice furniture, made it a nice space to work. And we've got storage people and DBAs and engineers and architects and all working together every day.
So before you go, the gentleman behind you in blue was waiting. So I'm just going to let him go quick. And then you guys are the last two, because I think we're almost at time.
So I had a question for all of you. Something Mike said earlier about you taking all of your physical backup media and deciding not to purchase that and move everything into S3. To what extent have you, all of you, taken to secure those backups and prevent them from accidentally being lost through accidental deletion or malicious deletion? How far have you segregated your environments to prevent, like, some bad guy or somebody accidentally with a bad Ansible code or chef deleting your entire environment and potentially even your backups? How far have you taken that?
So two different things there, because we treat our on-premise infrastructure and our cloud infrastructure differently. The on-premise stuff, which is what that project was that I was talking about, we do keep the most recent stuff actually on site, and it's really all of the history and long-term backups that have moved. So we have segregation there, and that's just done into our regular Amazon environment. For the cloud stuff, what we're doing is we're moving snapshots around. So we're moving snapshots between regions to get geographic resiliency, and we're moving it into a completely different account that has much tighter access controls and completely separate access controls. So in the doomsday scenario where somebody goes in and blows up our entire environment, they wouldn't be able to get at those backups. It's the seed repository in Iceland.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. But that auditors like to say, what keeps you up at night? That's the one scenario, right? Infrastructure as code means you can code and make it all go away. So we follow the exact same model that Mike just described. We're moving them into much more secured accounts. We move snapshots between regions to make sure that there's geographic diversity and availability. And we really try to aggressively pursue locking those things down so that you can't have that runaway script that suddenly brings everything or makes everything go away.
Yeah. Extremely similar. We basically have all our data in Redshift, and we take snapshots every few minutes, and we push the snapshots into S3, and the rest is.
Yeah. And then one other little tidbit we do operationally to protect stuff is we use tag-based access controls, and we have a production tag that we put on production instances, and you can't terminate something that has that tag on it.
And you also have some separation of duties, right?
We do. Exactly, yeah, Oren was talking about separation of duties. So in 12 seconds or less, the permissions that we've given are essentially, we give almost everybody read star, and then we give them more granular permissions where it comes to actually changing things. So it lets people be nimble and move around, but it also locks down security.
All right, go ahead.
Great. Just relative to the cost side, as you think about going all in, could you maybe quantify the cost benefits by going all in as you think about, I know that's a hard thing to do. And then, the second part of that question would be, even if the costs were higher, let's say, would you ever consider going back?
The last
Would you
part.
consider going back?
Yeah, just for cost reasons.
So for us,
agility.
we've seen pretty significant cost savings. On the things that we've actually been able to measure so far, it's on the range of 20 to 40%. Would we go back? No. And like I said early on, our goal was to be cost neutral or better. And cost neutral would be great. And I think with for the technical benefits that we're seeing, everybody from AWS, please cover your ears. I would pay a premium.
What? No.
I mean, I need a 30%
I would
discount
never
or I'm
pay a
going to
premium.
Azure.
Yeah, I would never pay a premium, Amazon. We're in the same range. For infrastructure, we have about a 30% cost, and then over the last year, we've made some mistakes and seen that diminish, and then we've fixed those mistakes and seen it come back. So, that's, I'm comfortable with that 30%.
Yeah, we're actually burning the ships, so we can't go back. So some of the stuff that we're actually adopting into the AWS framework would actually cost us millions to purchase. And so when it comes to cost, it doesn't make any sense to actually move back there, because we would obviously need to buy to the highest peak, right, to our cyclical workloads. So for us, it actually makes it to actually run them within the ecosystem of AWS.
Thank you.
Great. Well, we're at time. Thank you so much for getting up on a Tuesday morning here and getting together. And thank you for your time and everything you guys did. It was great. You did a great job. Give a round of applause.